Russia responds after the U.S. hit the country's two largest oil companies with big new sanctions over the war in Ukraine. Russia's foreign minister is now calling that move entirely counterproductive. And we are standing by to hear from Vladimir Putin. Also this morning, oil prices are rising sharply as traders are worried about a squeeze on the global supply that could be coming due to these sanctions. President Trump's actions showing signs that his patience with Vladimir Putin is waning. For now. He announced yesterday that he's nixed an anticipated summit with the Russian leader, a meeting that Donald Trump himself was very enthusiastic about just last week after his phone call with Putin. CNN's Claire Sebastian is tracking all of this for us, and there is a lot that has developed overnight. Claire.
Yeah, Kate, I think, first of all, this is, and we see this coming through in the Russian rhetoric this morning, a big political shift. Even before we start to talk about the economics, Russia has been through 9 months of the Trump administration where multiple deadlines and threats on sanctions have not been enforced, have essentially evaporated, or they've been able to sidestep them. Now these sanctions are in place, and they are bigger than even the Biden administration was prepared to do. Rosneft and Lukoil, the two biggest oil producers in Russia, they account for around half of Russian oil exports. So, look, this is definitely big. We're seeing rhetoric coming out from Russia brushing this off. The foreign ministry spokeswoman saying, look, our country has developed a strong immunity, she said, to Western restrictions, essentially saying that it's not going to have the desired impact. But then you hear from the former president, now deputy head of the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, saying the United States is our adversary and their talkative, quote, peacemaker, he says, has now fully embarked on the warpath against Russia. So they are having to recalibrate around this. As to the economic front, is this going to have the desired effect? Is this going to cost Russia enough to bring Putin to the table? That is just not clear yet. It depends on a number of things. Are these sanctions going to be heavily enforced by the US? Is Russia going to find workarounds, as it's suggested, as it's done so effectively so far in this war with things like the Shadow Fleet? And I think there's a big wild card around India as well. From talking to experts this morning, they import a lot of Russian oil at the moment, but they are involved in trade talks with the US, and there are suggestions that they might be likely to adhere to this US policy and perhaps cut back or stop exporting or stop importing Russian oil, and that would be a big problem for Russia. So we are really watching and trying to understand the impact of this and essentially what the US will do going forward. How much commitment will they show to enforce these new sanctions, Kate?
Yeah, and you're spot on, it seems, with the reality of it. The announcement, yes, important, coming from the Treasury and how they're saying it, but the follow-through and how it's going to impact the biggest purchasers of Russian oil and gas is really what needs to be seen and is not quite known yet. It's great to see you, Claire. Thank you so much.
Well, we're joined now by Peter Zalmayev, Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Appreciate you being with us.
Pleasure to be here.
So, US President Donald Trump met with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte at the White House Wednesday, making significant news on the war in Ukraine by announcing new sanctions on Russia's two largest oil companies, while also announcing he was shelving his anticipated meeting with Vladimir Putin, for now at least. Why has it taken President Trump this long to impose new sanctions on Russia, and will this be enough?
Well, first part of your question, of course, this has to do with Donald Trump's persistent, belief that Vladimir Putin is someone he could negotiate with in good faith. And this is not something that's unique to Donald Trump. If you remember, going back to George W. Bush, who saw into Vladimir Putin's soul and saw a beautiful man. I mean, Vladimir Putin is a consummate KGB agent. He is able and capable of manipulating, sometimes naive Western leaders, But in coming back to your second question, Donald Trump has had enough with Vladimir Putin. It started to hurt him politically. It started to hurt him apparently with his spouse, Melania Trump, as Donald Trump himself acknowledged. And every time, Donald, you talk to Vladimir, he turns around and bombs Ukrainian cities harder, as you just mentioned in the lead into this to our talk. A score of cities hit just after the conversation and apparent plan to meet in Budapest. And finally, there's been some pressure on the Hill, the normally complacent Congress, bipartisan support for some strong action on Russia. It's really been very difficult for Donald Trump, and he's seen that Vladimir Putin has not been willing to throw him any bone, meaning to make any meaningful concessions, meaning that he was not willing to make this Budapest trip for Donald Trump anything other than a repeat of the fiasco that we saw in Alaska.
And Peter, after previously threatening to supply Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, President Trump acknowledged for the first time Wednesday that he told President Zelensky he would not be giving him the long-range missiles due to the training required for their use. Why did Trump backpedal and appear weak, clearly, in the eyes of Putin?
Well, listen, Russian nuclear blackmail has been effective, and once again, whatever they spoke in that phone call, making plans to meet in Budapest, the major component of that for Vladimir Putin, who I actually don't believe really had intentions or believed that it would be worthwhile to meet in Budapest. I think he wanted Donald Trump to stand down on the Tomahawk threat because, contrary to what Russians are saying, Tomahawks do hurt. They are a serious threat to Russia's ongoing war efforts in Ukraine, in contrast to the sanctions that have been slapped on Russia, which is a good step. But will they force Putin to end this war, sit down and negotiate? Probably not in the near future. We've been here before, Rosemary. We've been here with HIMARS missiles. We've been here with F-16s with the Biden administration. Every time we hear that it's a huge escalation, it will take a long time to train the Ukrainians to use it, and then finally, every time we were given those weapons. So I wouldn't put too much stock on this. I think the issue is still very much on the table. But once again, Donald Trump wants to try other tools of pressure before he delivers the Tomahawks, because the Tomahawks are a clear escalation in this war.
And President Zelensky discussed his conversation with Donald Trump about the US president's suggestion to freeze the war along current battle lines. And now Zelensky says this is a good compromise. But that wasn't how he initially felt, was it? What changed his mind?
Well, it seems that there's been a concerted push by the Europeans to do exactly that. It's a painful compromise for Ukraine, but most Ukrainians are now on the same page with the rest of the world that Ukraine probably will not be able to get back the 20% of the territory it has lost over the last 3.5 years, or even longer if you take a longer span. The war started in 2014. So, as a matter of fact, this puts Donald Trump on the same page with the Europeans, and that's why the Budapest talks were a non-starter. Putin continues to insist on addressing what he calls the root causes of the conflict, which is a code for saying, destroying Ukraine's ability to run its own foreign policy, to run its affairs, essentially turning Ukraine into a semblance of Belarus next door, a puppet state. That's why Vladimir Putin is not interested in a ceasefire. He is not interested in genuine peace. He's not interested in any additional territory, any territorial concessions. It's not about territory. It's about controlling Ukraine and essentially annihilating Ukraine as an independent nation and Ukrainians as an independent culture with its own language, etc.
Peter Zalmayev, thank you so much for talking with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.